Hey everyone, and welcome back. I think we all find the global economy just fascinating. And today we're diving into something that could have been a major shakeup, a potential trade war between the US, Mexico, and Canada.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we're talking about three economies that are so closely linked, it's hard to imagine them actually going head to head on trade.
Exactly. And what makes it even more wild is that this stemmed from some pretty serious threats made by former President Trump to renegotiate the USMCA.
The USMCA, for those who need a refresher, is the agreement that replaced NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And this wasn't ancient history, this was just a few years ago.
Right. So we're going to be looking at excerpts from an article that really captures the tension of that moment and asking the big question. Could Trump's push to reshape the USMCA have actually sparked a full-blown trade war with, well, America's closest allies? And what would that have meant for everyone involved?
And to understand just how big of a deal this could have been, you have to remember that since the USMCA came into effect, Mexico and Canada have actually overtaken China as the top U.S. trading partners.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that significant already.
Oh, yeah. The ripple effects of a trade war would have been massive. So before we get too deep into it, maybe we should take a step back and break down what the USMCA actually is for anyone who might not be totally familiar with it.
Yeah, good point. Can you give us the quick rundown?
Sure. Basically, the USMCA, or the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, modernized the older NAFTA agreement. And when it passed, it actually had pretty strong support from both sides of the aisle, which is kind of rare these days.
So why this sudden urge to renegotiate if everyone was seemingly happy with it?
Well, the article points to a few key things that were motivating Trump. He wanted to encourage more auto manufacturing to move back to the U.S., and he also wanted to limit the flow of fentanyl and migrants across the border.
And I remember there was also talk about wanting more reciprocal trade relationships, to use a phrase from Senator Haggerty, who was a big Trump supporter.
Right, and that gets to the heart of what Trump was proposing, which was tariffs. He wasn't afraid to throw around some pretty big numbers either.
And he really believed in them,
Yeah.
not just as a bargaining chip, but as a way to actually bring in money for the government.
Absolutely. He thought they could generate serious revenue, maybe even enough to offset some of those tax cuts he put in place.
So he even floated a specific number, a 25% tariff on everything coming in from Canada and Mexico by February 1st.
Yeah, and on top of that, there was talk of a 10% tariff on Chinese goods, and even maybe tariffs on stuff from the EU. It's almost hard to keep track of it all.
Seriously, it's kind of mind-boggling. But could he actually just do that? Like, what's the legal basis for a president to just impose tariffs like that whenever they feel like it?
Well, it's not quite that simple. There are specific legal pathways, like Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which lets the president use tariffs for national security reasons, or the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which gives them a lot of control over trade during a national emergency.
So it sounds like his advisors were definitely looking into every possible option.
Yeah, from what their article says, they were exploring a bunch of different avenues. But of course, Canada and Mexico weren't just going to sit back and take those tariffs lying down.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Especially Prime Minister Trudeau. He's pretty clear that Canada was ready to retaliate with measures he called robust, rapid, and strong.
Right. And they even talked about targeting some pretty iconic American products with tariffs, like Kentucky bourbon and Florida orange juice.
Going after bourbon, ouch. That feels like a direct shot at American culture.
hmm
But beyond the symbolism, what kind of actual economic impact were they expecting?
Oh, the predictions were not good. Economists were saying Canada could even go into a recession, maybe a 3% drop in their GDP. And that's not even factoring in the impact on things like business confidence and investment, which would probably take a nosedive too.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what about Mexico? How do they react to these tariff threats?
Well, it seems like Mexico was trying to be a bit more level-headed about it. President Sheinbaum called for calm and pointed back to what happened in 2018 when they hit the U.S. with tariffs on steel, pork, cheese, and apples.
Oh, right. That was in response to some earlier U.S. tariffs, if I remember correctly.
Exactly. So they basically had a playbook from a previous trade skirmish they could draw on.
Interesting. So if we step back and look at the bigger picture here, it's pretty obvious how intertwined the U.S., Canada, and Mexico economies are. A trade war wouldn't really be a win for anyone.
You're absolutely right. These economies are so connected that any major disruption to that flow would be felt across all three countries.
And this whole thing was a real possibility, too. The article even mentioned that Trump was strategically waiting for his full trade team to be in place before making any final decisions about the tariffs.
So there was definitely a sense that he was being calculated about it, recognizing how big of a deal this could be.
Okay, so we've laid out the players, their motivations, and just how serious this almost trade war could have been. But this raises some really interesting questions about how this all could have played out in the long run.
One thing that really stands out to me is the contrast between the initial bipartisan support for the USMCA and then, just a few years later, the threat of these tariffs.
Yeah, that's a great point. It really shows how much the political landscape can shift and how trade, even between close allies, can become a political football.
Exactly. It's a stark reminder that political choices can have enormous economic ripple effects.
Right, and we were talking about things like potential recessions, job losses, entire industries being thrown into chaos.
Mm.
It really underscores how interconnected our economies really are.
It does. And it also makes you wonder about the broader implications for the future of global trade. If countries can't even rely on agreements that had strong support from both sides of the aisle, what does that say about international cooperation going forward?
It's a big question, for sure. Could it lead to more regional trade blocs forming? Will countries try to diversify their trading partners even more to spread the risk? These are all important things to think about.
Definitely. And speaking of important things to think about, maybe we should take a moment to explain why these tariffs were seen as such a serious threat in the first place. For our listeners who might not be as familiar with the ins and outs of global trade, could you break down what exactly tariffs do and how they impact economies?
Great question. So in the simplest terms, a tariff is a tax that a government puts on goods that are imported from other countries. For example, if the U.S. put a 25% tariff on Canadian steel, it means the price of that Canadian steel in the U.S. would go up by 25%. And the goal is to make those imported goods more expensive so that domestically produced goods become more competitive.
That's the basic idea, yeah. But of course, it's rarely that straightforward in the real world.
Right, because, as we've been discussing, those tariffs can easily lead to retaliatory tariffs from the countries whose goods are being targeted. And that's how a trade war gets started, a back and forth, where everyone keeps raising tariffs on each other's products, and in the end, it's usually the consumers who end up paying the price.
It really is a lose-lose scenario most of the time. And it's not just about higher prices either. Trade wars can also mess up supply chains, which can lead to shortages of important goods and delays in production and shipping. And remember, we're talking about the US, Canada, and Mexico here, economies that are super interconnected. They depend on each other for all sorts of stuff.
That's a crucial point. It reminds us that trade isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. We're talking about real people's jobs, their livelihoods, their ability to put food on the table.
Exactly. And it also highlights why it's so important to understand the history and development of trade agreements like NAFTA and the USMCA. These agreements often represent years of negotiations and compromises, and they're meant to create a system where trade between nations is fair and beneficial.
Speaking of NAFTA and the USMCA, one of the things the Trump administration said they wanted to do was bring auto manufacturing back to the U.S. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Was that a realistic goal, and what would have been the potential consequences of trying to do that?
It's a tricky issue for sure. The auto industry, especially in North America, is so integrated. You've got parts and finished cars moving across borders all the time as part of a super complex supply chain. Trying to untangle that and shift production entirely to one country would be incredibly disruptive, not to mention expensive.
So the idea that you could just flip a switch and bring all those manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. was never really feasible.
Not without causing a ton of economic problems, both in the US and in Canada and Mexico. You have to consider things like the availability of skilled workers, the cost of labor and production, the existing infrastructure, and the whole system that supports the industry. It's not as simple as just building more factories.
It sounds like it would have been a recipe for unintended consequences, to say the least.
Yeah, for sure. And it also highlights the fact that businesses make decisions based on a whole bunch of factors like cost, efficiency, access to markets, and a predictable regulatory environment. Just slap on some tariffs might not be enough to change those factors and make companies move their operations.
It reminds us that economic policy, especially when it comes to global trade, needs to be thought through really carefully, taking into account all the different pieces and how they fit together.
Definitely. And that brings up another interesting point from the article. Trump thought tariffs could generate a lot of revenue for the government, maybe even enough to offset those tax cuts he had passed. Is there any truth to that argument? Can tariffs actually be a reliable source of income for a government?
That's a question economists have been debating for a long time. And while tariffs do bring in some money in the short term, they can also have negative long-term effects on the overall economy, as we've talked about. So, trying to use tariffs as the main way to fund government programs or to balance out tax cuts isn't really a sustainable approach.
It's kind of like trying to cover your bills by dipping into your retirement fund. You might get some quick cash, but you're putting your long-term financial security at risk.
That's a great analogy. It
Hmm.
really highlights the need for economic policies that are based on a long-term vision, not just short-term gains.
For sure. And it also emphasizes how important it is to understand the interconnectedness of global markets. In today's world, what one country does economically can have far-reaching consequences for other countries and the global economy as a whole.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the details of trade agreements and how tariffs work to the potential fallout of a trade war and the political forces behind these decisions.
It's been a really interesting conversation, and for our listeners out there, remember that knowledge is power. The more we understand about these complex issues, the better equipped we are to navigate the constantly changing global landscape.
And for those of you who found this deep dive insightful, we'd love to hear what you think. What are your main takeaways from exploring this potential U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade war? What resonated most with you? Please share your thoughts and insights in the comments below. We always appreciate hearing from our engaged and globally minded listeners.
And if you're enjoying these deep dives into these complex global topics, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. We're passionate about bringing you clear, engaging, and thought-provoking content that helps you understand the world around us.
And don't forget to share the knowledge. Tell your friends, family, colleagues, anyone who might appreciate a deep dive into the fascinating world of international trade and geopolitics. Until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Yeah, it really does drive home the point that we're all in this together, whether we like it or not. And this situation also shows how political decisions can really have big economic consequences.
Absolutely. We were talking about recessions, job losses, whole industries getting disrupted. It's crazy how interconnected our economies really are.
It is pretty wild. This whole scenario also makes you wonder about the long-term effects on global trade in general. Like, if countries can't even depend on agreements that had strong support from both sides of the political spectrum, what does that say about the future of international cooperation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Could this push countries to form more regional trade blocs? Or maybe to diversify their trading partners even more to spread the risk? There are so many possibilities.
There are. And speaking of exploring different angles, maybe we should take a minute to explain why these tariffs were seen as such a big threat in the first place. For those listening who might not be experts in global trade, could you break down what tariffs actually do and how they impact economies?
Sure. The simplest way to think about it is that a tariff is basically a tax that a government puts on goods coming in from other countries. So let's say the U.S. puts a 25% tariff on steel from Canada. That means the price of that Canadian steel in the U.S. market would go up by 25%. And the idea is to make those imported goods more expensive, which makes domestically produced goods more competitive.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. But of course, things are usually a bit more complicated than that.
Right. Like we've been saying, those tariffs can easily lead to other countries putting their own tariffs on goods from the U.S. And that's how you get a trade war, with everyone raising prices on each other's products. And usually, it's the consumers who end up footing the bill.
It's a classic case of everyone losing out in the end. And it's not just about prices going up either. Trade wars can also mess up those carefully planned supply chains, which can lead to shortages and delays. And remember, in this case, we're talking about the US, Canada, and Mexico. Their economies are deeply connected and rely on each other for so many things.
That's a really important point. It reminds us that trade isn't just about abstract numbers. It's about real people's jobs, their livelihoods, their ability to support themselves and their families.
Absolutely. It also underlines why it's so important to understand the history and evolution of trade agreements like NAFTA and the USMCA. These agreements are often the result of years of negotiations and compromises, and they're meant to create a system for trade between countries that's fair and benefits everyone involved.
Speaking of NAFTA and the USMCA, one thing the Trump administration said they wanted to do was bring auto manufacturing back to the U.S. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Was that a realistic goal, and what might have happened if they had tried to do that?
Well, it's a very complex issue. The auto industry, particularly in North America, is incredibly integrated. You've got parts and finished cars crossing borders all the time as part of a very intricate supply chain. Trying to untangle that and shift production completely to one country would be incredibly disruptive and expensive.
So it wasn't really feasible to just flip a switch and bring all those manufacturing jobs back to the U.S.
Not without causing some serious problems, both in the US and in Canada and Mexico. You have to think about things like finding enough skilled workers, the costs of labor and production, the existing infrastructure, and the whole ecosystem that supports the auto industry. Building more factories isn't a simple solution.
It sounds like it would have created a whole bunch of unintended consequences.
Exactly. And it also highlights the fact that businesses make decisions based on a whole range of factors like costs, efficiency, access to markets, and a stable regulatory environment. Simply imposing tariffs might not be enough to overcome those factors and convince companies to relocate their operations.
It's a reminder that economic policy, especially when we're dealing with global trade, needs to be very carefully considered, taking into account all the interconnected parts and potential consequences.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another interesting point that came up in the article. Trump believed that tariffs could actually bring in significant revenue for the government, possibly even enough to cover those tax cuts he had implemented. Do you think there's any validity to that argument? Can tariffs really be a dependable source of income for a government?
That's a question that economists have been going back and forth on for years. While tariffs can generate some revenue in the short run, they can also have long-term downsides for the economy as a whole, as we've discussed. So relying on tariffs as the primary way to pay for government programs or to balance out tax cuts isn't really a sustainable strategy.
It's a bit like trying to cover your expenses by dipping into your retirement savings. You might get a quick influx of cash, but you're really just jeopardizing your long-term financial well-being.
That's a great analogy. It emphasizes the need for sound economic policies that are built for the long haul, not just for quick wins.
Absolutely. And it also underscores how crucial it is to grasp the interconnected nature of global markets. What one country does economically can ripple out and impact other countries and the global economy as a whole.
We've really delved into a lot in this deep dive, from the specifics of trade agreements and how tariffs work to the potential consequences of a trade war and the political factors that influence these decisions.
It's been a really engaging discussion, and for our listeners out there, remember that knowledge is power. The more we understand these complex issues, the better prepared we are to navigate this constantly changing global landscape.
And for everyone who found this deep dive interesting and insightful, we really want to hear your thoughts. What were your main takeaways from this look at a potential US-Mexico-Canada trade war? What stood out to you the most? We'd love for you to share your insights and perspectives in the comments. We always appreciate hearing from our engaged and globally minded listeners.
And if you've been enjoying these deep dives into these complex global issues, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any future episodes. We're passionate about making these complex topics clear and accessible, and we hope you'll join us for more thought-provoking conversations.
It really makes you think, how this situation, if it had blown up, could have completely reshaped the relationship between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico.
Yeah.
Imagine if Canada and Mexico had felt like they had to get even closer economically because of all the tension with the U.S.
It's like a what-if scenario on a massive scale, right? One seemingly small policy decision can have huge knock-on effects, often in totally unexpected ways. It really underscores how interconnected things are, not just economically, but politically as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it shows how important it is for leaders to really understand not just economics, but also geopolitics, and to be able to anticipate those potential ripple effects that can come from what might seem like isolated decisions.
It reminds us that we live in a world that's super complex and interconnected. Collaboration and thinking strategically are more important than ever. And it brings us back to the importance of knowledge and really understanding how things work. The more we, as citizens in this globalized world, grasp the complexities of trade, economics, international relations, the better prepared we are to have informed discussions, make good decisions, and hold our leaders accountable.
Couldn't agree more. And that's what we try to do here on the Deep Dive, to give our listeners the knowledge and insights they need to make sense of this complex world. So to our listeners all over the globe, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this potential trade war that thankfully never happened? Did we miss anything important? Did this conversation give you any new insights? Share your thoughts and perspectives in the comments. We always appreciate hearing from our engaged and globally minded audience.
And if you found this deep dive insightful and interesting, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. We're passionate about diving deep into these complex global issues and breaking them down in a way that's clear and understandable. We hope you'll join us for more conversations like this one.
And don't forget to spread the word. Share this episode with your friends, family, colleagues, anyone you think might appreciate a deep dive into the world of international trade and geopolitics. Until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.